The rules of money are permanent until they are not. The promise is sacred until it is not. The system is sound until the moment it needs to save itself. This isn't a flaw in the system. It is the system's oldest feature, and once you see it, you will see it everywhere. Who owns the world's debt? The answer is not a country, it is a system. Welcome to Financial Historian. The world currently owes over $300 trillion. That's more than 3 times the value of everything the planet produces in an entire year. That number presents a paradox. Debt is a simple relationship. For every dollar owed, there must be a dollar owned, a creditor for every debtor. But if every major nation, from the United States to Japan, is a debtor, then who exactly is the world's creditor? The comfortable answer is foreigners, or more specifically, China. It is also, for the most part, wrong. Take America's $34 trillion national debt. The largest single holder is not a foreign power. It is Americans themselves. Your future Social Security, the Federal Reserve, the pension funds and insurance companies that hold your retirement savings, and the banks that hold your deposits. The creditor is not a person, it is a system. A vast web where our own savings, through these institutions, are lent back to our own governments. I will show you how this pattern repeats from the age of gold to the age of digital money. The system saving itself is not a bug, it is its primary function. And it begins with the promise the Bank of England made and the wartime crisis that forced it to choose between that promise and its own survival. But this system, where a promise can be rewritten, is not a product of the digital age. Its blueprint was drafted in London over 2 centuries ago. The year is 1797. Britain is locked in a costly war with revolutionary France, and the nation's gold reserves are draining away to pay for armies and allies. The Bank of England, a private institution acting as the government's banker, held the public's trust. Its promise was simple. Any banknote could be exchanged for a fixed weight in gold. But as fear of a French invasion spread, a panic took hold. Citizens rushed the bank, demanding gold for their paper. It was a classic bank run, and the vaults began to empty. On Sunday, February 26, 1797, the government and the bank made a choice. To save the system, its foundational promise had to be broken. The next morning, a notice was posted on the bank's heavy oak doors. It announced a restriction on all cash payments. The redemption of notes for gold was suspended. Officially, this was a temporary measure, a necessary tool to see the nation through the crisis of war. It was not a default, the government insisted, just a pause. That temporary pause lasted for 24 years. Until 1821, Britain's global commerce ran not on gold, but on a currency of pure paper, backed only by the state's authority. The state had learned a powerful lesson. In an emergency, it could sever the link between money and its physical anchor, and the system would not only survive, it would obey. Britain financed the rest of the war against Napoleon not with gold it didn't have, but with credit it could now create at will. A new form of financial power had been unlocked. The core of the promise was hollowed out, yet the system grew stronger. What was meant to be a temporary fix had just become a permanent tool in the state's arsenal. For a century, the lesson of 1797 seemed contained. The world entered the era of the classical gold standard, a system that promised automatic, impartial stability. This system was seen as a work of nature, not politics. A country that spent too much would lose gold, its money supply would shrink, and it would be forced into austerity. And then came August 1914. The gears of the global machine did not just slow down, they jammed all at once. To finance a war of unprecedented scale, every major combatant, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, did exactly what the Bank of England had done in 1797. They suspended the gold standard. The solemn promise to convert paper into precious metal was again temporarily set aside for the national emergency. Gold was hoarded by the state. In its place, governments issued mountains of unbacked paper debt to pay for shells, guns, and the lives of soldiers. The inevitable result was a wave of inflation that hollowed out the savings of a generation. The German mark, the French franc, even the pound sterling lost a huge portion of their value. The impartial financial system was revealed to be entirely conditional. When the survival of the state was on the line, the stability of its people's money was a secondary concern. After the war, nations tried to put the genie back in the bottle. They attempted to return to gold, but the world had changed. You cannot rebuild trust on a broken promise. The 1797 event was no longer a single precedent. It was now a proven, universal rule of modern statehood. A nation's promises about its money are valid only until the next crisis. The chaos of the interwar years taught the world a lesson. A system with no anchor leads to disaster. So in 1944, the Allied powers met to build a new, more durable order. In July 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war economic world. Their solution was a system where all major currencies were pegged to the US dollar. The dollar, in turn, was to be pegged to the ultimate anchor, gold. The United States, holding over 2/3 of the world's monetary gold, made a promise. Any central bank could exchange its dollars for our gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. Effectively, the dollar was now as good as gold. It became the world's reserve currency, the single foundation upon which global trade and reconstruction would be built. For 2 decades, the system worked. It fueled an unprecedented economic boom, known as the Trente Glorieuses in France and the Wirtschaftswunder in Germany. But the old pattern began to stir. The U.S. was spending enormous sums on a war in Vietnam and on its domestic Great Society programs, printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. Foreign central banks, particularly in Europe, began to notice the growing imbalance. They started to quietly exercise their right, exchanging their surplus dollars for U.S. gold. The mountain of gold at Fort Knox began to shrink. The global promise made by one nation to the entire world was becoming impossibly expensive to keep. The system was built on a single fixed promise, and that promise was only as good as the gold in the vault. A familiar choice was now looming over the world's most powerful nation. By the summer of 1971, the choice could no longer be delayed, and on a Sunday evening, August 15th, the President of the United States made that choice for the entire world. He announced a series of measures to combat inflation and attack speculators. But near the end came the critical sentence: the U.S. would suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The gold window was slammed shut. The central promise of the Bretton Woods system, the anchor of global finance for 27 years, was broken by a single televised announcement. Once again, the key word was temporary. That temporary suspension remains in effect today, more than 50 years later. Some promises are designed to be broken. In that moment, for the first time in history, all of the world's major currencies became pure fiat, money backed by nothing but the word of the government that issued it. The final link to any physical commodity was severed, not by market forces, but by a political decree. The world's money was now completely untethered. The power this unlocked was immense. The primary constraint on government borrowing, the need to have enough gold to back the currency, was simply gone. For America, it solved an immediate crisis. It no longer had to honor its gold debts. For the rest of the world, it was a shock. Their dollar reserves were no longer as good as gold. They were just dollars. This was not a system failure. This was the system working as designed. When pressed, the core nation will always prioritize its own stability over its international promises. It's a rule. This event didn't just break the old system, it created a new one, with new rules and a new, even more abstract version of the same old pattern. The age of fiat had begun. The end of the gold standard didn't end the pattern. It supercharged it. In a world of money backed only by promises, the system needed a new tool for the inevitable crisis. That crisis arrived in 2008. The global financial system, drowning in bad mortgage debt, seized up. The fall of Lehman Brothers showed that banks no longer trusted each other. No private buyer would touch the toxic assets. So central banks, led by the U.S. Federal Reserve, began a radical policy with a clinical name: quantitative easing. In simple terms, they created new money, digitally, and used it to buy financial assets, including their own government's bonds. Trillions of dollars were created from nothing. This was the final evolution of the pattern. The state didn't just break a promise to pay gold. It now had its own bank create money from thin air to buy its own debt. The pattern was repeated, but on a vastly larger scale, in response to the 2020 pandemic. As the world locked down, central banks created trillions more to finance enormous government deficits. The central bank is now the buyer of last resort for the state's own debt. The government borrows, and the central bank provides the money to do so. A perfect circular logic. So, who owns the world's debt? We began with that question. The answer is now clearer. In a crisis, the system increasingly owes the debt to itself. The rules of money were rewritten, from a promise of gold to a promise of nothing, to a system where the debtor can now print the money to buy its own debt. This brings us to the uncomfortable truth. The value of our savings, our pensions, our deposits is denominated in a currency whose rules can be and have been rewritten for the system's survival. The line between a central bank and a government's treasury has never been more blurred. In your view, at what point does a temporary emergency measure become the permanent way that money works?